most of you know Nicholas Kristof and his wife Cheryl Wudong, or I think the first husband and wife team to win a Pulitzer Prize together. Isn't that right?
For journalism.
For journalism.
Will and Ariel Durant beat us to it. They won a Pulitzer Prize for literature, but important ones, of course, are for journalism, right?
and that was for covering Tiananmen Square,
That's right.
So there's that. And then you won a second Pulitzer for your coverage of the genocide in Darfur, but you were greedy and kept that just for yourself. And you and Cheryl have written 4 books together, 2 of which I think we're going to have for sale out here, and you get to sign them. You get to buy them, and he gets to sign them.
It's a deal.
And one is Half the Sky, which I'm sure all of you know about, on the role of women and girls. The second is A Path Appears, and that'll also be out there. And that actually became a PBS series, didn't it? Where you traveled to Haiti, to Colombia. Where did you go?
Yeah, actually, both were a documentary series on PBS, which for a scribbler was a kind of amazing experience to have cameras all over and try to make this work. But we traveled to Asia, Africa, and Haiti, Colombia, and in the U.S. as well.
Yeah, and then of course there's China Wakes and Thunder from the East, both about Asia, of course. But we'll move from there. I want to also point out that you've covered presidential politics. The most foreign assignment you've had is covering presidential politics here in the United States. So let me, because I didn't get to see your column this morning, I'm going to cheat and have you read aloud to me, or else give me your summary. What did you have to say about poverty in America? And tell me how you think that may be shaping the politics of today.
So every year for more than a decade, I've taken a student journalist with me on a reporting trip around the world to try to highlight global poverty and to get more attention paid to it. And this year, partly because the presidential candidates were not talking about domestic poverty, I decided, okay, I'm going to take my win-a-trip journey in America and look at poverty right at home. And so we went to Arkansas and Oklahoma and really looked at some of the toughest kind of challenges and cycles of poverty. And it's just, just about every kid within some of these communities was born with drugs in their system, grew up in a violent, dysfunctional home, sexually abused, self-medicated with narcotics, ended up with problems with the juvenile justice system, in a school district that was catastrophic, educational failure, and in many cases then, became pregnant as teenagers and started the cycle over again. When you can have some of these kids and you can make a prediction that this kid, based on the zip code that they're born in and the circumstances of their birth, are more likely to end up in college, in prison than in college, then that is not a reflection of that infant. That is a reflection on the larger society. And I do think that these days, there are no magic wands we can wave, but we do have evidence-based approaches that make a difference, and that in many ways, in many cases, actually save public money down the road. If you don't invest at the front end, you end up paying more at the back end. And yet we don't invest in the front end, even though it would have this transformational effect on so many lives and help break this cycle of poverty. And partly we don't do that because the issue is invisible. And that's partly the fault of us in the media, frankly.
And that's why you cover it.
And that's why, I'm in the lighting business.
So as you think about the levers for change, because we do have the knowledge, we know about this cycle, we know that teenage girls who have unwanted pregnancies are pretty close to guaranteed to ending up in poverty. I mean, there's certain,
right.
Is that right? So I guess my question is, when you've done a lot of covering of nonprofit organizations and citizen groups that have decided to intervene at key moments to try to fix problems like this, are there organizations that you've been struck by that are doing a good job in this area, or are we wanting?
I mean, it is striking how, I mean, you can't make a generalization about nonprofits. There are some that are evidence-based, doing extraordinarily good work, and there are some that do pathetic work, and there's certainly an awful lot of what we think of as the charitable sector that isn't actually helping poor people, but it's affluent people helping other affluent people, and partly for social reasons and so on. And but there are, I mean, there really has been a revolution in philanthropy, and there are so many more people who now measure, how to have good metrics, have borrowed from the business sector, and study how they do, they evaluate what they do, they use randomized controlled trials to see what works, at what cost. And so 20 years ago, we kind of had a gut sense of what might work and what might not work, both abroad and at home. These days, we have evidence. The problem is we tend not to implement that evidence. I mean, you mentioned the teenage pregnancies. So American kids have sex, as far as we can tell, at the same rate as European kids, based on surveys. But American kids have babies 3 times as often. And that seems to be because American kids don't have as good access to comprehensive sex education or to reliable, long-acting, reliable contraceptive. And when there was a good study in St. Louis that showed that if you provide at-risk girls with long-acting reversible contraceptives, then you save public money. For every dollar invested, you save $7 down the road. Colorado did something similar with private funding, and likewise very successful, and yet we don't do it. I met a girl who got pregnant summer after 6th grade. She said her baby was almost 2 years old before she finally got her family health class. A lot of good that did.
Yeah. What we have seen in recent time is really positive, real progress when it comes to poverty globally. And you've covered the
best kept secret in the world.
And well, let's speak to that. What does the American public think is, where do they think we are on the poverty agenda?
So, the one thing in this incredibly polarized environment, the one thing the Democrats and Republicans agree on is that the world is an incredible mess, that the struggle against global poverty has been a failure, that over the last 20 years the number of poor people has stayed the same or gotten worse. Finally we have a consensus, we agree on something, and it's totally wrong. In fact, there have been unbelievable strides in this period. Global poverty, extreme poverty, measured as today in terms of its index for inflation, but less than about $2 per person per day, has dropped by more than half in that period. Child mortality has dropped by more than half in that period. When I was in college, 44% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty. Today, it's less than 10%. In our lifetime, we are going to reduce that pretty close to zero. And you look at literacy. For all of human history, until the mid-1960s, a majority of humans had always been illiterate. Today, 85% of adults are literate. And literacy does incredible things to people, to a society, in terms of their capacity to earn money, to look after the people they love, perhaps to get along together. The evidence is still a little more mixed on that. But those gains are just transformational.
Yeah. Now, back when Kofi Annan first introduced the notion of Millennium Development Goals, a lot of us thought he was sort of starry-eyed. It was such a dramatic goal. The notion that nations around the world would unite around them and actually act on them seemed pretty far-fetched at the time. Yet the goals were met way ahead of schedule. To what do you attribute that?
I think that the Millennium Development Goals, they did help by providing some metrics by which countries, leaders, in effect kind of competed, or they could be embarrassed or they didn't meet those goals. But I think that was secondary. I mean, I think the more important reason why we had advances against poverty and disease were that you had some economies that adopted more market-based, more efficient policies, China, India in particular, and that a lot of it was really a result of the engine of economic growth. And plus, we got a lot better at health interventions, things like malaria, childhood vaccinations, oral rehydration therapy to address diarrhea, micronutrients. We weren't even aware of micronutrients before, and now we know that, iodine, if kids don't get iodine, that shaves up to 10 IQ points off that person for the rest of their life if they don't get that in utero. That iron deficiency, folic acid, zinc, vitamin A, all these things really, really matter for the rest of a person's life. And you need to think not just about the number of calories that a child is getting, but about those micronutrients. That may be even more important than the calories.
So China, India, Nigeria, others opened and connected their economies, right?
Yes.
And so that accounts for some large chunk of...
A large chunk of it.
Of people moving from poverty into the middle class.
I think there was also kind of a demonstration effect. I mean, so I was living in Asia for much of the 80s and 90s, and China adopted these economic policies partly because it was embarrassed that it saw that Taiwan and Hong Kong and Singapore and South Korea had been so successful, and its own economic policies have been so disastrous. So it began to experiment in that way under Deng Xiaoping. And then, as it was very successful, India, which had previously been satisfied with very low rates of economic growth, it began to copy some of those policies. It helped that it was facing an economic crisis at that time. And then as India began to unleash its forces as well, that had Pakistan took note of that. Bangladesh did as well. There was a sense in which, as some players in the neighborhood became more economically competitive, and other people paid attention to that. We've seen something similar in Africa as well.
Yeah. But as you grow your economy, that doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be an inclusive economy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I know that's so important. And one thing I really hope the rest of the world learns from us is our mistake. I think that one of the great mistakes we've made since the 1970s is that we've enjoyed economic growth as a whole, but we didn't pay adequate attention to how that was divided, and that has caused enormous social dysfunction in this country. And this election is a reflection of that dysfunction. And I hope that other countries will reflect on what I think was a historic mistake in that period, and will try to aspire not only to overall economic growth, but also to a more inclusive growth that benefits everybody, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because the ship is more likely to stay afloat if it does so.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about that and the impact on our society and on our politics, and then we'll go back to the developing world after that. But we've known for a long time that a portion of the society, without smart policy, that a portion of our society, a large portion, would experience a declining standard of living. Yet we didn't implement the policies that would address that. As you look at the job of the next president, does that necessarily need to be at the absolutely top of the agenda?
I think it does, and I think that's not only for some obvious reasons, but if only whites voted in this election, Donald Trump would win by about 11 percentage points. It would be a landslide for Trump. And that is a function of a lot of working class whites across America who feel the system has completely failed. I'm from rural Oregon, an area that was based on manufacturing and timber. And it's reflective of a lot of these areas. When I was in high school, if you had a high school degree or maybe a 10th grade education, then you could get a well-paying union job. You were on the ladder. That kind of collapsed right around 1980. And the result has been all these dysfunctions happening at the same time. I look back and I think in the US, in 1964, we passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and in 65, we passed the Civil Rights Act in 65. How was it that in America, you had working class whites who supported civil rights legislation that was historic? How was it that working class whites at that time were able to make way for members of racial minorities, whereas in 2016, those same constituencies want to, in many cases, ban Muslims and are very strong Trump supporters. And I think that part of it is that if you were a working class white guy in 1965, you were living a better life than your parents had lived. You thought your kids were to be living a better life down the road. And now that is no longer shared, and people feel under attack, and they're less likely to be inclusive, and that social fabric is gone. So I think we have to think about broader-based economic growth and economic development kind of for the good of the social fabric of the country, and in part that has to be based on educational changes. You can't have broad-based economic growth unless you think not only about minimum wage policy, but also about educational policy. And the US is more or less the only country in the OECD where the neediest kids get the fewest resources in education because of our educational structure. Basically, suburban, affluent white kids get a great public school education, and low-income kids, black or white, get a third-rate education that perpetuates this kind of inequality.
Okay. I mean, the gap between the earning capacity of those with a high school degree and those with a college degree is growing exponentially, is it not? So.
That's right. I mean, there's actually some reason to think that maybe the return from higher education, that it was very true in the past. There's some experts think that maybe that may no longer be so true in the future, but it's certainly has been very true. And there's, again, we have learned some things about how to reduce these education gaps, and one of the big lessons is the importance of early interventions and early childhood interventions, and that's where you get the most bang for the buck. And we invest heavily in, there's been a lot of talk in this presidential campaign about college tuition, college policy. You have to start thinking about that 0 to 5 space, and unless you think about that 0 to 5 space, these at-risk kids are not going to be in a position to go to college when they're 18. And early childhood education is so much cheaper than the higher education issues. And yet, as a country, that's what we neglect.
There's another area where we could learn from Europe, and that's the apprenticeship model that we don't use. Say something about that, or about how we should be thinking about jobs going forward and preparing for jobs.
I think there are a lot of I tend to be fairly liberal, and I don't tend to quote Ronald Reagan very much. But the one thing that he was right about was he talked about, I shouldn't say that in California, that's mean, okay? But one thing that he was absolutely right about was the best social program is spelled J-O-B. And we now, again, have good evidence of that. And I think that there are a million, again, I think kind of liberals have been too focused on the issue of minimum wages. And I think that can be part of the solution. But I also think one has to just do a lot more sometimes with creating jobs and introducing people to them. One can do much more with apprenticeship systems. One can do much more with community colleges and vocational training. And there are these programs called career academies, for example, which take at-risk kids, and at the end of high school, it involves a dose of apprenticeship, a dose of very strong apprenticeship training, and again, they pay for themselves when they're targeted to these at-risk kids, who otherwise we're willing to spend. Juvenile detention can cost $80,000 or more a year, and we're in Arkansas last week. I met a kid. It really affected me that this is a kid who was kicked out of the house at age 13 by his mom's boyfriend. He was homeless. Everything going against him. At 16, he robs a pizza delivery guy with a friend. The friend gets the pizza. He doesn't even get a slice of pizza. He runs off. He gets caught. He's tried as an adult, is sentenced to 12 years in prison at age 16. He just got out in August after serving 9 years. The state of Arkansas spent $200,000 plus incarcerating him. And he has this felony record, which will make it much harder for him to get a job, to build a family, and
to get housing and to vote, depending on
to
what
get housing,
state
to vote, all these things. And they were willing to invest $200,000 in incarcerating this kid, but not $20,000 helping him early on when he was a homeless kid. He was illiterate when he was arrested. When he desperately needed help, then, that's when we were unwilling to help him and support him.
A lot of people think that there'll be only a handful of issues around which one can gain bipartisan consensus when the new president comes in. And one of them is juvenile justice reform. Another is early childhood education. Say something about, and I promise we'll go back to international issues in a minute. I'm having too much fun on things I don't get to talk about in my day job. But say something about juvenile justice reform and the politics of it.
Well, both, with mass incarceration more broadly, whether it's juvenile justice or adult criminal justice, so to speak, systems, this really is one area where there is a pretty broad agreement. And some of the red states have done a great job reducing incarceration rates, both of adults and of juveniles. They've done it for different reasons, and blue states have done it. Red states have done it because it's expensive. But if one can figure out ways to move forward on this issue, and then, that is just terrific. And as you say, early childhood education is another area where polling suggests there is very strong support across the board. And there are red states that Oklahoma is a leader in early childhood education. And they do it not as a social justice issue or because it's the right thing to do, but because it saves money. And I hope that the next president can figure out ways of advancing on this. Frankly, one of my things that makes me nervous is that if Clinton is elected, what issue has Hillary Clinton been associated with more than any other for the last 30 years? It's children's issues. And I'm afraid that early childhood interventions will then become a Democratic issue in ways that make it difficult for Republicans to support it. And that would just be so tragic.
Now, when a new president comes in, they almost invariably walk in with a terrific domestic agenda, right? They want to get it all done in the first 100 days, but at least, get a start. And every time they walk in and they find they've inherited a really tough set of international issues that won't go away. And obviously, number one is going to be Syria for this next president. You disagreed with the Obama administration's approach to Syria.
I do. I generally admire President Obama. I agree with him on a lot of issues, and I'm generally pretty dovish on issues. I was against the Iraq War. I was against the Afghan surge. I think that, but I also think that in liberal circles there has been, people have taken the mistakes of Vietnam and Iraq too far and thought that the military toolbox, have just disavowed the military toolbox. And I think there are times when the military toolbox actually has its purposes, and I think Syria is one. And the point is not to bomb Syria into oblivion. The point is to get a ceasefire. How do you stop the mess? Hopefully you get a ceasefire, a negotiated ceasefire, and then freeze the divisions. Maybe it becomes a little like Cyprus, and 20 years from now you try to sort it out, but at least stop the slaughter. President Obama is absolutely right that there are enormous risks of getting involved. I think in 2011 he also thought, reasonably, that President Assad was going to slip out of power on his own. That was a reasonable thing to think. It was wrong. And we didn't intervene when 5,000 people had been killed. At this point, somewhere around 500,000 people have been killed. And it's going to go on from here. Do we intervene when 1 million people have been killed? And I don't think that we should dispatch ground troops there. I think that would be unhelpful. But when I look at the slaughter, when I look at how the war in Syria has exacerbated the Sunni-Shia divide in ways that create instability throughout the entire region, at the way the refugee flows have destabilized Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, and for that matter, Europe. I think that it has to be imperative for strategic as well as humanitarian reasons to try harder to resolve that. And I do think that taking out Assad's capacity to his air power to drop bombs is maybe the best lever we have. The smart people that I know who look at this say one can do this from Turkey. Turkish officials have told me they would allow us to do that with standoff missiles, and it might be to destroy Syrian military runways. It doesn't last very long. They could rebuild them. Then you fire another missile and crater the runways again. That means you don't have to tangle with Russia. If Russia wants to be Syria's air force, then it can do that for a while. I don't think that it will want to do that indefinitely. I think that Assad has a fairly modest air force. I think that might change their willingness to negotiate a ceasefire. John Kerry's big frustration with the White House was that he felt he didn't have any leverage in the negotiations because there wasn't this ability he didn't have anything. And that's the kind of leverage that he wanted. Will this work? I don't know. Are there risks? Absolutely. But there are risks in our passivity. 500,000 people have died. There are 5 million refugees outside the country. ISIS has emerged. Neighboring countries have been destabilized. And as I weigh those risks against each other, I think we can be more active in trying to avert the slaughter.
So compare this. Compare this to our ultimate response to Bosnia and Kosovo. We took a long time there, particularly in the case of Bosnia, but compare this to our ultimate response.
Well, I think
where you did have the threat of force.
Yeah, I think this was fairly similar. We were traumatized by Vietnam, and then it took, years. And then the first President Bush really tried to pursue a multilateral policy. And I think probably all of us in this room believe in multilateral solutions to the extent we can. It didn't work. And France under Mitterrand was fairly pro-Serbian. There was basically no multilateral way to stop the slaughter. And then, and President Clinton initially wasn't inclined to do much, was nervous about it, and then finally political pressure forced him to, and Richard Holbrooke, who is somebody I was a friend, somebody I really admired, I thought was a great strategic thinker. He always emphasized that he was able to work out the peace agreement there, the Dayton Peace Accord, because he also had military tools in hand. And you have to aspire to work out peace agreements, but unless you are willing to deploy military tools and make people pay a price, then it is sometimes impossible to reach that kind of a peace agreement. And it's hard, again, when in the Kosovo operation. Kosovo may be the first time in U.S. history that we've intervened to stop a genocide. But the White House folks were just terrified that it wasn't working. And it wasn't working until the day when it did. And even now, Kosovo is a mess. I was there a few months ago. But it's much less, there are no perfect solutions, but you can't let the perfect be an enemy of the good. And we were so much better off ending the slaughter in the Balkans, and we would be so much better off if we imperfectly ended the slaughter in Aleppo.
Did you get to go to the Bill Clinton bakery when you were in Kosovo?
I did. I went by it. I didn't actually buy any baked goods, but and it's and there's this incredible statue of Bill Clinton there, and a lot of kids named Bill Clinton and named Tony Blair.
Yes, Tony Blair and Bill Clinton. So the most powerful image that I have when I think of Bosnia was the stream of refugees. Here, a genocide was happening in a European country, and we'd only just a few decades before said never again. And you watched this stream of refugees not being welcomed warmly, and not with a willingness to use force. And what they had in common with the Syrian refugees is they were Muslim. Surely that has sent some message. Is it fair to say that image that I see is an image that many Muslims see and question whether we'll stand up for them?
I think that it is outrageous that we haven't been more welcoming to refugees. We've taken about 11,000 Syrian refugees. Canada has taken more than 30,000, much smaller population. And just the vehemence we've directed toward Syrian refugees, portraying them as some kind of terrorists who are going to slaughter us in our sleep, I find deeply offensive. But I'm not so sure that around the world of all the things that the American image suffers for, I'm not sure that that is that high up, considering that many Muslim countries have, Saudi Arabia has taken 0 Syrian refugees.
And in fact, none of the Gulf states.
None of the Gulf states have. They have given work permits to some Syrians, and Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey have been just incredible. But I think there are many reasons we should do an infinitely better job on the refugee crisis, but I'm not sure that the sort of international image is the foremost one.
So as you look at Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, the frontline states, 1 in 4 people in Lebanon is a Syrian refugee right now.
That's right.
What is the challenge they face in terms of educating the kids?
200,000 Lebanese, 200,000 Syrian kids in Lebanon aren't in school. And look, I just outlined what I think we should do in Syria, but it's hard. It might not work. President Obama disagrees, and maybe he's right. It's hard to fix the factors that are pushing people out of Syria. We know how to fix the problem of 200,000 kids not getting an education in Lebanon. Education is something we know how to do. The problem there is resources. And if you don't educate a generation of refugee kids, then you're creating the next cycle of instability down the road. Education is cheap, it's efficient, it's something we really do know how to do, and yet, as an international community, we don't. We failed that so decisively, and I think maybe too much of the discussion has been, not here, but too much of the kind of international discussion has been about Western countries accepting refugees. And that's a discussion to have, and it's important, but there also are risks that if one is too accepting, one is going to encourage more refugees crossing the Mediterranean and dying en route, and one is going to empower nationalist right-wing parties in Europe and so on. There are problems with it. There are essentially no problems with trying to boost educational opportunities and job opportunities, healthcare for refugees in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. And we don't do it.
So you have the problem that they can't educate their kids there. They also can't work there, right? Earn livelihoods.
Yeah, they can't leave. I mean, a lot of people do work kind of under the table, but getting legal positions is very difficult.
So are those the two factors that inspire them to take that dangerous journey across the Mediterranean, to get into Europe, to get opportunities for work and for education for their kids?
If you love your kids, if you're a Syrian and you love your kids, and you're stuck in, I mean, some people have managed to find good situations. Most folks aren't living in camps. They found some way of some community to be in. But in many cases, for those who haven't, if you love your kids, you're going to try to get to Europe or America, wherever it may be. I'm here because my dad was a World War II refugee from Romania, and he finally made his way to France, and then he felt that France wouldn't be fully accepting of an East European refugee or his yet unborn children, and so came to the U.S. And there were a lot of reasons why Americans might have thought that a refugee from the Soviet bloc might be a communist, might undermine us, might be a spy. I'm glad we didn't vilify him in the way that we are much too often vilifying and otherizing people today.
We always think about the presidential race because that's been the focus of this conference, but it's also been the focus of the last 2 years. But there's another transition underway, and that's the UN Secretary General. And it's going to be Antonio Guterres, who has been the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. What is the significance of him taking that job in part, but also coming from the position he's in? Does that mean that the refugee crisis, this is like 60 million worldwide, I mean, it goes way beyond Syria. Does that mean the refugee crisis will get better high-level attention?
I hope it will, but at the end of the day, the way to solve the refugee crisis, I mean, it's not the Band-Aids one puts on. It's trying to address the causes that are forcing people to leave. And I like Guterres. I think he's been outspoken as the refugee chief. I hope he continues to be outspoken. The power of the Secretary General is essentially the power of the bully pulpit. I think that he will use that better than some of his predecessors have. But I don't know that I'm that optimistic that he can address the forces that are causing people to flee from Syria, from Afghanistan, Iran, South Sudan, and Nigeria.
Nigeria. Yeah.
And I do think that the U.S. could show more leadership on these issues. You know, when the U.S. pays attention to places, it is kind of astonishing what happens just by virtue of us paying attention, that suddenly insoluble problems become partly solvable.
Let me take you to one of the things, we actually have a question. I better get to this question before I get to my question. And this question asks, what kind of hope you have for the Sustainable Development Goals, the follow-on to the Millennium Development Goals. Far more, even more ambitious. It's the eradication of extreme poverty. There's, I think, 17 goals.
Right.
Say something about how you think we'll do on those.
So, I mean, the critical one here is eradication of extreme poverty. And that's defined as within a 3% margin. So 3% of the world's people could still be living in extreme poverty, which is a lot of people worldwide, and we would have met it. But I think we will have met that. There'll still be a lot of poor people, but people living less than $2 a day, we may well have achieved that by 2030. That is an incredible thing for humanity, that for the vast, for as long as human beings have existed, vast majority of them lived essentially at a subsistence level and died at a subsistence level. And on our watch, we're poised to end that and overcome that. One thing that I do worry a little bit about is media attention. I think that it's hard to get international attention on issues like poverty at home or abroad unless they're what people are talking about. In this presidential election, nobody is talking about either global or domestic poverty. And if you think that we in the media have done a lousy job, and I think we have, over the last 15 years addressing these issues, I think we're going to do an even worse job in the next 15. And that is because the business model for television, for newspapers, for news magazines is essentially collapsing. And if you were the executive producer of a TV show, you can send a camera crew off to Burundi to look at poverty or the risk of genocide there. And your ratings will go down compared to putting a Democrat and a Republican in a studio together and have them yell at each other. And that is the challenge that we face. And I guess the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation had a few years ago, they in effect bribed ABC News to cover global poverty. They gave it was called a grant. But it was controversial because why should the Gates Foundation be paying ABC executives to do their job? But in fact, ABC did terrific reporting on maternal mortality, on micronutrients, and so after a year, the Gateses went back to ABC and said, we'd like to renew our grant. And ABC said, no, we don't want to take your money. Because when we air these important stories, that's when viewers switch the channel. Mm. I got to say, as a journalist who deeply believes in the potential of news to spotlight issues, that is really a painful situation. But a challenge to all of you. You all have your own spotlights. And if we in our business drop the ball, then I hope you will all pick it up yourselves.
With that, thank you.
Thanks.